Everyone thinks America's military power comes from aircraft carriers, fighter jets, and overseas bases. They're looking in the wrong place. The real source of US power is something you can't see, because if Washington needed to, it could transform huge parts of the global economy into a military supply network almost overnight. And that's why something strange is happening right now. The US military seems to be retreating. Massive bases across Europe and the Middle East are shutting. Maps suggest America is pulling back. But satellite imagery tells a completely different story. Deep in the Philippine jungle, on remote Pacific islands, in places most people couldn't find on a map, new runways, fuel depots, and military facilities are appearing. This is Subic Bay in the Philippines. It was once America's biggest overseas base. Then it closed in 1992. That was the start of a trend. The US military had 1,600 foreign bases during the Cold War. Now, 800, officially, and those bases are cutting themselves to the bone. On the opposite side of the world, Thule Air Base in Greenland, once the linchpin of the Arctic, has been cut down from 6,000 troops to 150. Even Ramstein Air Base in Germany has been downsizing. There were just 5,000 more troops left by May of 2026. Then there's Peleliu, a small island in Palau. It was the site of a fierce battle in World War II, but was abandoned afterward because, well, look at it. It's in the middle of nowhere. And that's why it's perfect. It's all part of the Pentagon's secret network. The US military rebuilt the World War II runway in 2024 and made it big enough to host most aircraft in the fleet, including the massive C-130 Hercules. At first glance, building runways on tiny Pacific islands makes no sense. After all, the US Navy already has 11 aircraft carriers, but that's exactly the problem. Aircraft carriers are enormous. They're visible, and in a modern war, visibility can be a liability. 30 years ago, a single carrier strike group could sail into a region and change the political climate overnight. Sometimes it didn't even need to fire a shot. In 1996, during the Taiwan Strait crisis, the United States sent 2 carrier groups through the region. The message was so overwhelming that Beijing backed down. But the world has changed. Today, America's adversaries have spent decades building missiles specifically designed to find and destroy targets like aircraft carriers. Even in combat zones like the Persian Gulf, the carriers are operating hundreds of miles away from Iran's coastline. It's the only way the Pentagon can make sure they stay safe from missiles and drones. That was evident on February 5th, 2026, when an Iranian drone got dangerously close to a carrier. And Iran isn't the benchmark. China is. If a regional power can create problems for a carrier group, imagine what happens when America's most capable rival is involved. But carriers still have one advantage: they can move. The same can't be said for America's giant overseas bases. Their coordinates are public. Their runways can be found on Google Maps. In a conflict, they're among the first targets on the list. So if carriers are becoming more vulnerable and traditional bases are increasingly exposed, where does the Pentagon go next? Somewhere hard to find. Somewhere harder to hit. The money tells the story. Billions of dollars are flowing into a scattered network of remote airstrips, logistics hubs, and island outposts across the Pacific. Between 2000 and 2021, the US military spent between $70 and $120 billion to build or expand overseas installations, even as the old bases closed or shrank. Congress appropriated billions more during those years for construction projects at unspecified locations around the world. The strangest part is that nobody really knows how large this network has become. Many of these sites are funded under vague categories like unspecified locations. The public doesn't know how many there are. Congress often doesn't know either. In 2017, 4 American soldiers were killed in an ambush in Niger. The attack triggered something more uncomfortable than grief. During the Senate hearings that followed, multiple members of Congress admitted they had no idea the US military was operating in Niger at that scale. They didn't know roughly 1,000 American personnel were stationed in the country at all. Nobody had told them. Nobody had needed to. The troops had arrived, been supplied, and been operating for months through a logistics network that required no congressional base authorization. The ambush just made it visible. The question it forced was the one Washington least wanted to answer. How does an army of 1,000 soldiers appear in a country without anyone noticing? So the US military's reach to these unspecified locations starts with the fleet. The US Navy has less than 300 battle force ships today. That sounds like a problem, especially when you realize that at the end of the Cold War, the fleet was nearly twice that size. For decades, admirals and politicians have warned that the Navy is getting too small. They keep calling for more ships, but the fleet keeps shrinking because the shipbuilding capacity just isn't there at the moment. It's not necessarily by accident either. It's partly because the US Navy has a ghost fleet, one that's harder to target. Ever heard of the Combat Logistics Force? Most people haven't. And if you saw one of its ships at sea, you'd probably mistake it for an ordinary tanker. That's the point. They don't have any weapons, at least none that they can shoot. The people inside them are civilian merchant sailors. It's just one of the Pentagon's many clever disguises. These merchant ships aren't really merchant ships. The giveaway is right there in the name: USNS, United States Naval Ship. They may look like commercial vessels, but they answer to the Military Sealift Command, not a shipping company. The cargo isn't anything you can buy on Amazon. It's everything the US Navy needs to fight. Ships that deliver food, ammunition, repair parts, and oilers that deliver fuel. These ships are pre-positioned around the world, carrying the things the US needs to stage an operation. Each of these units can support up to 17,000 Marines and sailors with all their ground, sea, and air assets. And no one knows much about them. But the dependency goes even deeper than logistics. Much deeper. The US military can't even do proper reconnaissance without the Combat Logistics Force. One of the tasks these ships have is supporting scientific and technical missions, and collect data on enemy missiles and submarines. Beginning in late January of 2026, the US military staged assets in the eastern Mediterranean and around the Arabian Peninsula. The USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R. Ford were both part of this, with at least 11 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, along with a screen of destroyers, attack submarines, and other warships spread across the region. Thousands of additional troops were brought to the region on over 250 military airlift flights. Iran was surrounded. It was the biggest military buildup in the Middle East since 2003. And it would have been useless without two offices you've never heard of. The Military Sealift Command has an office in Manama, Bahrain, and its European office in Naples, Italy. So Combat Logistics Force ships like the USNS Henry J. Kaiser and USNS Carl Brashear were there to deliver dry cargo like food, ammunition, and fuel. For decades, the Middle East was the easiest place on Earth for the US military to get fuel. That was one of the region's advantages. The network worked because everything was connected. A vast supply chain that could keep American forces operating almost indefinitely. But when that network comes under pressure, the consequences spread fast. Suddenly, the fuel wasn't where it's supposed to be. The ships that normally move can't operate freely. Ships that were specially equipped to offload fuel into the US Navy's oilers at sea were trapped. The Strait of Hormuz has become the world's most expensive choke point. So, the Navy had to adapt. Instead of relying on fixed ports, it now depends heavily on civilian crewed oilers like the Henry J. Kaiser class, ships that operate far offshore, refueling warships in constant motion. One ship comes in to transfer fuel, another pulls away after topping off, and the cycle repeats while the source of fuel shrinks. It's an important lesson for the US military to learn. Any fight with China over Taiwan would amplify this issue. The good news for the US Navy is that this system has been tested in modern operations and proven it can still function. Each oiler can carry roughly 6.8 million gallons of fuel, enough to fuel a Boeing 747 jumbo jet for over 5,000 hours of continuous flight. The bad news is scale. There are only 32 ships in total, and only 15 of them are oilers. So the math holds up, in theory, but that's only if everything goes right, and the clash with Iran is showing that it doesn't take much to go wrong. For years, security experts in Washington have warned about the U.S. military's vulnerability in sea lift capacity. Relying on a handful of unarmed civilian ships to bear the huge fuel burden isn't a viable strategy in a world where the enemy is a competing state with drones and missiles on standby. This isn't the war on terror anymore. Suppose an emergency breaks out in the Pacific over Taiwan. Because, as we've already seen, that sea lift capacity is thin. In a conflict fought across thousands of miles of open ocean, thin quickly becomes fragile. With only 32 ships in the Navy's combat logistics force, backup is needed. Technically, there are 40 other ships sitting in reverse in America's ports in case things do go wrong, but many of them are aging, so it's not enough. So the Pentagon relies on something called VISA. It's the Voluntary Intermodal Sea Lift Agreement. It was created in its modern form in 1997, and it's one of the least understood parts of America's military logistics system. When a crisis hits, the U.S. government can tap into privately owned, U.S.-flagged merchant ships and commercial shipping capacity. These ships are there for the U.S. military to use in emergencies, and during a war, they swing into action. They have to. If a shipping company enrolls a vessel in the VISA program, it's committing that ship to be available to the U.S. government when it's activated during a national emergency. At that moment, military transport requirements take priority over normal commercial scheduling. There's no direct payment from the Pentagon to these ships, but the reward is still considerable. Their owners get priority in future cargo contracts with the Department of Defense during peacetime. That's why 90% of the militarily useful ships in the U.S. flagged fleet have signed up for the Sea Lift program. There are now 60 ships in the fleet, and they'll stay there until at least 2035. By extending its reach into the U.S. merchant fleet, the Pentagon gains access to vast commercial shipping capacity. Hundreds of thousands of 20-foot container units, millions of square feet of heavy lift cargo space, and millions of tons of global shipping deadweight capacity that already moves through international trade every day. Most of the world's largest commercial vessels operate under foreign flags, outside the scope of programs like VISA. They can't simply be taken over. Instead, influence comes through something far more subtle: contracts. In a crisis, the U.S. can outbid almost anyone for shipping capacity, not by seizing ships, but by paying for priority access to them. It's a pretty clever setup, but it's not necessarily an innovation. It hasn't even been activated before. Instead, it's a copy of something the Air Force has been doing and has used before. The U.S. military has over 13,000 aircraft, by far the most of any fighting force on Earth, with cargo planes like the C-130 capable of moving troops, vehicles, and heavy equipment directly into forward positions. But the overwhelming majority of American service members don't actually get to their far-flung destinations by way of those aircraft. The gates at Terminal E in BWI International Airport in Maryland or in Seattle-Tacoma Airport in Washington look ordinary. The people going through them look ordinary. But if you trace where those flights actually go, the destinations aren't random vacation hubs or commercial routes. They connect directly to U.S. military deployments across Europe, the Middle East, and strategic Arctic locations like Greenland, or across the Pacific to places like Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. Most of the people going through those gates are active members of the U.S. military, but they're not using Air Force planes. It's the same model that civilian operators use: Atlas Air, Omni Air, National Airlines. The difference is the cargo. It's known as the Patriot Express. It's there to cater to troops that are on official leave or get orders to move from one base to another. These private companies are so integrated into the DoD's transportation network that they can operate on some of the most secretive real estate on Earth. Naval Station Norfolk, the biggest naval base in the world. From here, troops can fly the Patriot Express to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. It's more expensive than having troops travel on the airlines most people book, but it's more efficient, too. It's also much cheaper than moving all the troops around with huge cargo planes like the C-5M Super Galaxy, which costs $57,500 for every hour it's in the air. Then there's the 40 hours of maintenance for each hour in flight. With that price tag, it simply doesn't make sense to use those aircraft for routine movements. So the Patriot Express is there to fill the demand, and it is enormous. 340,000 people ride these planes every year. Remember, there are about 170,000 personnel stationed overseas at any given time. And these personnel are often accompanied by family members. It's a constant supply of customers. As far as the airline business goes, it's about as secure as you can get. The Pentagon pays well, but these special airlines are always looking for a way to make more money. That's why there's Space A. The US military might be busy, but even Patriot Express flights aren't fully booked. If you're an airline owner, that is a disaster. Flights are expensive no matter who your customer is, so the corporate suits make an offer. Retired service members are allowed to snatch up Space A when their travel plans happen to line up with the planes. They're even allowed to bring their pets on board. It's one more benefit to being a veteran of the US military, and one more way to put money in the pockets of the airline owners. But the US military's reach into the airline business extends a lot further than some contracts with specialized carriers. Things got tough in Afghanistan in the summer of 2021. As the Taliban closed in on Kabul, troops and certified refugees had to be withdrawn rapidly. The US Air Force's logistics network came under stress. It doesn't have the capacity to meet the demand, so it needed to look elsewhere. Not to the Patriot Express, and not to its expensive cargo planes. So they turned to the Air Force's Civil Reserve Air Fleet. 18 planes in the fleet were called in to help move people around as the situation in Afghanistan became critical. Sure, the Patriot Express carriers were involved, but 4 came from United Airlines, 3 came from Delta, and 2 were from Hawaiian Airlines. They moved troops around from locations in Qatar, Bahrain, and Germany because the normal aircraft were overwhelmed. That's the Civil Air Fleet in action. It's made up of 450 aircraft spread across 25 different carriers that range from your preferred airline to FedEx and UPS. Each of them has contractually pledged 30% of their passenger fleet and 15% of their capable cargo fleet to the program. The airlines maintain operational control, but if they get the call from the Pentagon, they have to have aircraft and qualified aircrew available. They must be ready to support the mission within 3 days of the phone ringing. There's no backing out of it. 268 of these aircraft are for long-range international missions, and these were the ones used in Afghanistan. The Pentagon doesn't pay to maintain the fleet, but if they were all activated, those planes can handle 90% of the military's passenger traffic and 40% of its cargo. It's like being a landlord and charging the tenant for all the upkeep until you need the building. The contracts can amount to over $1 billion a year, as seen during the build-up to Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. But all that cargo on the ships and the planes has to be stored somewhere. There's no other choice. Today, much of it exists in places most people never notice. Warehouses behind port facilities, temporary staging areas near airfields, commercial logistics hubs under military contracts. The same pattern, just different addresses. It's called the Defense Logistics Agency. Maybe you can just call it the world's biggest warehouse, because the numbers are staggering. The organization typically manages and distributes 5 million line items in a year. Average annual revenue? Between $45 and $47 billion. By comparison, Amazon's total inventory value for 2025 was $38.3 billion. The headquarters are in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, but this operation spans every state to 122 international locations. But there's a catch. The Pentagon doesn't want to be in the warehouse building business, just like it doesn't want to be in the airline business. So it leases the space from civilian partners. Once orders get placed, the inventory gets shipped, but the US military doesn't do much of the shipping either. It doesn't even have the capacity to move all the merchandise. So, just like with the voluntary sea lift ships and with FedEx in the Civil Air Fleet, it relies on a vast group of third-party logistics firms to do the heavy work for it, literally. These private companies transport 98% of the textiles the US military needs. Uniforms, winter clothing. Those contractors also supply 86% of the spare parts and almost 100% of the fuel. Much like the pseudo-sailors aboard ships like the USNS Carl Brashear, the drivers are civilians. And they're not taking these goods into the old-style bases. They're going into civilian ports around the world, which carry 90% of the US military's sea lift and 40% of its cargo airlift. Almost all of the cargo moved by sea, the short cargo flown by air, came from these ports, not military bases like Pearl Harbor. This all depends on purely civilian infrastructure and civilian port workers. But there's something strange about this. With dwindling overseas bases to go to, where do these planes actually land during a foreign conflict? What ports do the Navy's ships sail into? How can they operate in foreign, sovereign territory? Remember those 122 international locations? It's all part of a paper trail that stretches further than any air trip. The overseas bases might not be what they once were, but the US military has signed acquisition and cross-serving agreements with over 120 other countries. That means only one thing. The market's opening up. These agreements are comparatively small, about a few $billions collectively every year, but it's not the size of the wallet that matters in this case. It's where the wallet is, and what you do with the real estate. Behind the scenes, the US military relies on a web of agreements that most people never hear about. Some are straightforward. They allow the military to purchase supplies from other countries or international partners when needed. That includes everything from fuel to equipment to logistical support. Others are more complex, built around reciprocal arrangements where allies contribute resources in exchange for shared access during operations. But both systems lead to the same outcome: pre-positioning. Instead of waiting for a crisis and then shipping everything in, vast amounts of material are already stored in advance, placed close to where they might be needed. In some cases, even the infrastructure itself is pre-positioned, enough to assemble functioning bases in a matter of days. So, when forces arrive, they aren't starting from scratch. They're arriving into a system that is already waiting for them. The effect is the same as pre-positioning an entire military without declaring a base. The US military can buy locally, store them in local warehouses, and then get what it needs from its partners in the theater of action. It doesn't need to ship stuff across an ocean. That's what helps the US military to fulfill its mission of being ready to take on any threat in the world within 3 days. And no one really knows where it all is. In fact, the Pentagon's records on everything that comes and goes are a little sparse. What we do know is that these shadow logistics deals have played out in a big way in the last few years. Ukraine falls without them. It's that simple. In the first year of the conflict, the White House used the Presidential Drawdown Authority to transfer over $20 billion in weapons and equipment to Ukraine. No act of Congress was required, no base authorization needed. The system that nobody knew existed moved faster than any formal military deployment could have. The NATO alliance has the most heavily integrated network of access sites and pre-positioned materials. That's what allowed the United States to get military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine rapidly early in the war. No act of Congress was needed. Thanks to Presidential Drawdown Authority, the White House can take weapons or services from Defense Department stockpiles and transfer them to partners. The president can issue the order at any time and deliver it to anyone that the White House wants. But the cross-servicing networks played out in a more obvious way during Operation Epic Fury. The United States has these agreements with almost every important country in the region: Qatar, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and so on. Let's look at that deal with Saudi Arabia as an example. Access and cross-servicing goes both ways. Sometimes it actually makes America money. The Saudis actually paid the US military and American businesses for the supplies their military needs under the deal. It doesn't matter if it was against the Houthis in Yemen or for the defense against Iran's missiles and drones. They paid for it. The Pentagon took the model of the Civil Reserve Air Fleet and expanded it. Now it's not just Delta Airlines on the hook. It's entire countries. ACSA agreements are supposed to be reciprocal and revenue neutral, but the ones that sign on to the deal also have to surrender their infrastructure. If there's ever competing demand, the US military wins. Just look at Qatar. The US military has a forward headquarters at Al Udeid Air Base. On the surface, it looks like one of those old military bases in the Middle East, with 10,000 personnel stationed there at the start of 2026. But who's doing the heavy lifting to support those troops? Not the Americans. The Defense Logistics Agency buys and receives all the goods shipped in these locations, but Qatar does the logistical work. It keeps the ports humming for ship calls and maintains the local infrastructure for transporting supplies. When the US military launched Operation Epic Fury, it got first rights to those ports, roads, and warehouses. Not just on the base, but scattered around. All the risk got outsourced, at just the right time, too. But the network has a vulnerability nobody in Washington likes to talk about publicly. COSCO, the China Ocean Shipping Company, is the world's largest shipping conglomerate. It is state-owned, and its vessels move through American ports every week. Several major U.S. port terminals have Chinese investment or operational involvement, including the Port of Long Beach, one of the two busiest cargo gateways on the entire West Coast. That is the same West Coast port infrastructure the military depends on to move equipment and supplies toward the Pacific. But empires built on contracts have a weakness that empires built on territory do not. In a Taiwan conflict, the US would be activating its civilian logistics network at the exact moment China could direct its state-owned shipping assets to do the opposite. Cancel contracts, withdraw vessels, prioritize other customers, create delays at terminals where Chinese capital has a seat at the table. The Pentagon can't seize those ships. It can't compel foreign-flagged vessels. It can outbid competitors for capacity, but only if the capacity is available and willing to be bid on. The network that makes American power projection invisible in peacetime becomes visible and fragile at the moment it is most needed. The ultimate weapon is a contract, and contracts can be broken. Installations like Al Udeid had their heyday in the late 90s, but in today's age of missiles backed by cheap drones, they're sitting ducks. Iran's provided the preview over the past few months. By the end of the first month of the war, 13 U.S. military bases in the Middle East had been heavily damaged by Iranian missiles and drones. Central Command needed to disperse troops around the region to make them less vulnerable. And if Iran can do this, everyone in Washington dreads what China can do to the bases in the Indo-Pacific. There has to be another way. And there is. Two, in fact. Those private airlines don't just take troops and other DoD personnel to the bases that Iranian and Chinese missiles are targeting. The US military is so massive that it's gotten into the hotel business. The biggest is Air Force Inns, with 89 locations, but the other branches have special lodging too. There are about 82,000 rooms available worldwide used for troops on temporary duty, permanent relocations, training rotations, and civilian contractors. These hotels aren't the dingy barracks. Take the one near Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, for example. The location has its own golf course and swimming pool, and it's even pet-friendly. These hotels used to be something of a joint venture. The military operated and staffed them with the support of civilian contractors hired by the base. But in 2025, the Air Force at least announced it was about to do some restructuring. If that sounds like corporate speak, it is. It's now looking for a private company to take over completely, and hopes to have a partner in place in 2027. There might be 20 or so nuclear weapons at Incirlik, but for the Pentagon, letting the hotel chain in is all part of the plan. More contractors will need to have access to even more remote sites for the US military's shift away from giant bases to succeed in the long term. Because they're popping up all over the place. Pelelu was just one. Satellite footage picked up something strange on Balabac Island in the Philippines in 2019. By 2024, it had transformed into a brand new station with a 2-mile runway. Technically, it's supposed to be for humanitarian and disaster relief purposes, but just look at the geography and you'll see what the builders were really thinking. Balabac is the most westerly island in the Philippines. In other words, it's the perfect spot for the US military to monitor and potentially intervene against China's fortified islands in the Spratlys. But most importantly, these lily pad bases work on the defensive side. Just look at Balabac's location. It's further from the Chinese mainland, which means it's much easier to protect against missiles and drones than bases like Cadena Air Force Base in Okinawa with its 20,000 service members. It's also a lot less costly if the missiles and drones make impact. It's basically a runway, some warehouses, and a small number of troops that rotate in and out. If Cadena gets damaged, it's a disaster. If one of these micro-bases goes down, there are others that can take its place. Balabac is just one lily pad. The U.S. military signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the EDCA, with the Philippines in 2014. There are 9 locations in the Philippines now, spread across the country. China would have been able to target Subic Bay in the past and cripple the U.S. military's operations in the South China Sea. Now, America has diversified its portfolio. In fact, the EDCA has been so successful that Washington's taken the idea to the middle of nowhere. That's why Peleliu's been rebuilt. It probably wouldn't be the site of a battle between the US and Chinese navies like in World War II. It's too far from China to make sense as a battleground. But the airfield's presence allows the US military to get in supplies and get out quickly at a safer distance. There's another major positive to the lily pad strategy too. The politics work out much better. Cold War-era bases like Cadena or Ramstein have been controversial for years. They're meccas for local civil disobedience. Every year, the locals on Okinawa protest the US bases. In 2018, 70,000 people took to the streets, even as Japan's tensions with China were increasing fast. But who's going to protest a runway and some warehouses in the middle of nowhere? Naturally, Washington loves these new lily pads, so Peleliu isn't the only former World War II battleground being revived. The US military is also reviving Northfield on Tinian in the Northern Marianas. There's just one thing missing from this lily pad strategy. On the surface, it can look like a fragmented, almost do-it-yourself approach to global military posture, but that's exactly the point, because the Pentagon has been moving away from doing everything itself. This is the island of Yap in the Federated States of Micronesia. It's between America's bases on Guam and Palau, and the U.S. Air Force is interested enough in it to request $400 million to spend on this tiny island. The plan? Extend the runway at the island's international airport so that it can support U.S. military aircraft. The strategy itself doesn't change. It's still about extending reach deeper into the Pacific, further from China, and building resilience in case key hubs like Guam come under threat. What changes is the method. Instead of solely relying on traditional military bases, the system increasingly folds in civilian infrastructure, especially commercial airports and logistics hubs in remote regions. We know how the troops and supplies move, who moves them, and the legal strategies they use to get around. Now we know where they're increasingly going. Add them all up and the strategy behind the Pentagon's secret web gets revealed. The US military can fight wars on opposite sides of the world if it has to. Not because it has the most aircraft, ships, or armed fortresses, but because it can use the global economy to suit its own purposes. If it seizes up mid-crisis, American forces in the Pacific don't run out of weapons. They run out of fuel, parts, and beds within days. The network is real, the access is real too, and the vulnerability is also. That's why the US military's ultimate weapon is a contract, not an aircraft carrier. The US hasn't built a global empire of land. It's built a global empire of access. Access that no one else has, and you are flying on it. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. Really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MatPack.